It doesn't look expensive at first. It looks normal. An apartment, a car, a few subscriptions, a routine. Nothing excessive, nothing that feels out of reach. That's what makes it easy to accept, because it doesn't feel like a decision. It feels like default. You move out. You get a place. You get a car to move around. You add small comforts, streaming, food delivery, convenience, things that make life smoother. And none of it feels heavy on its own. Each piece is manageable. Each cost makes sense. Each decision feels justified. But the system isn't built on individual costs. It's built on accumulation, stacking, layer after layer. Rent locks in a monthly obligation. The car adds another. Insurance, fuel, maintenance. Then subscriptions, small amounts, but constant. And once they're all combined, you're no longer choosing expenses, you're maintaining them. That's the shift most people don't notice. You don't feel like you're spending. You feel like you're sustaining, holding everything in place. And that requires consistency. Not just effort, income. Steady, reliable, continuous. Because the moment income pauses, everything else doesn't. Rent doesn't stop. Payments don't wait. Subscriptions don't pause themselves. The system keeps running. And now you're not just earning to grow, you're earning to maintain. Maintain the apartment, maintain the car, maintain the lifestyle. Maintain the version of normal you stepped into. And that's where the cost really begins. Not in the price, but in the commitment. Because every fixed cost locks a portion of your future income in place before you earn it. Before you decide what to do with it, it's already assigned. So over time, your income stops feeling flexible, stops feeling like something you control, and starts feeling allocated, pre-decided, pre-spent. And that's why it feels stable, because everything is predictable. You know what's due. You know what's required. You know what it takes to keep things running. But that stability has a cost. It removes flexibility. It reduces options. It limits how much you can move. So it looks like security, but it behaves like structure. A structure you have to continuously support every month. And the longer you stay inside it, the more your income exists to maintain it, instead of building something beyond it. It doesn't stop at the big expenses. That's just the foundation. What really builds the weight are the small things. The things that don't feel serious. The things that feel optional. Streaming, music, apps, food delivery, convenience. Each one feels harmless, cheap enough to ignore, easy enough to justify, normal enough to accept. Because none of them demand a decision. They just ask for permission, once, and then they stay. That's how the system expands, not through pressure, through ease, through comfort. You don't feel like you're adding weight. You feel like you're improving your life, making things smoother, faster, more enjoyable. And each upgrade feels small, insignificant, until they're not. Because they don't stay isolated. They stack, one after another, layer after layer. A subscription here, another there. A service you barely use, a charge you forgot about. But it never forgets you. That's the difference. You forget the expense. The expense doesn't forget you. It keeps running every month, no matter what changes, no matter how often you use it. It doesn't care about value, only continuity. And over time, those small charges become fixed. They stop feeling optional. They become part of your baseline. You don't review them. You don't question them. You absorb them. And now your income has more places to go, more commitments, more obligations, more systems to maintain, all built on things that once felt small. That's how convenience turns into structure, quietly, without resistance, without awareness. Because nothing about it feels forced. It feels chosen. But once it's all combined, you're not choosing anymore. You're maintaining. Maintaining access. Maintaining comfort. Maintaining ease. Maintaining a system that keeps charging, whether you think about it or not. And that's where it shifts, from convenience to commitment. Because every small subscription adds another fixed piece to a life that now depends on continuous income. If this made sense to you, you already understand more than most people do. This channel exists for that kind of awareness. Like the video, subscribe. Nothing here is accidental. At this point, everything feels stable. Nothing feels out of control. Nothing feels uncertain. You know your expenses, you know your routine, you know what it takes to keep things running. And that creates a sense of comfort, a sense of control, a sense that things are handled. But comfort isn't the same as freedom, and control isn't the same as flexibility, because everything works as long as nothing changes. That's the condition, the part that stays hidden. Everything holds together as long as income stays consistent, as long as nothing interrupts the flow. But the moment something shifts, everything tightens, because there's no space, no margin, no flexibility to absorb change. That's the trade. Comfort in exchange for mobility, stability in exchange for options, predictability in exchange for freedom. And it doesn't feel like a loss, because nothing is taken all at once. It happens gradually, quietly. You stop taking risks, not because you're afraid, but because you can't afford disruption. You stop exploring alternatives, not because you lack interest, but because your structure requires consistency. Your decisions start filtering through one question: will this affect my stability? And if the answer is yes, you don't take it. Not because it's wrong, but because it's incompatible. That's how options disappear, not through force, through structure. The more fixed your life becomes, the less flexible your decisions are. The less you can move, the less you can shift direction, because every change now has a cost, not just financially, structurally. You're not just adjusting your life, you're disrupting a system built on consistency, on repetition, on predictability. And the longer you stay inside it, the more it defines your range, what you can do, what you can risk, what you can walk away from. So it feels like comfort, it feels like security, but what it actually creates is dependency. A system that works as long as you keep feeding it, as long as you keep earning, as long as you keep maintaining. And the moment you stop, you realize something important. You were never free inside it. You were just stable within it. At the end of it, it doesn't look like a trap. It looks like a life, a place to live, a way to move, comfort, convenience, everything in place. And that's what makes it hard to question. Because nothing feels wrong. Nothing feels excessive. Nothing feels like a mistake. But that's the design. Not to overwhelm you, but to normalize it. So you don't see the cost as a trade. You see it as living, as responsibility, as maturity. But every fixed cost is a claim on your future income. Not once, repeatedly. Every month you maintain it, you're reinforcing the structure, strengthening it, locking it in further. And over time, your income stops being yours. It becomes assigned, allocated before you even receive it. So when you think you're buying comfort, you're actually buying obligation. When you think you're creating stability, you're committing future effort, future time, future energy, future focus, all dedicated to maintaining what already exists, not building something new. That's the difference between paid stability and real freedom. Paid stability requires continuous input. It only works if you keep earning, if you keep showing up, if nothing interrupts the flow. Real freedom doesn't depend on constant maintenance. It creates space, options, the ability to move without everything collapsing behind you. And most people never question that difference because what they have feels stable enough. Until they want to change something, until they want to move, until they want to stop. That's when it becomes clear. You weren't just living, you were maintaining. Maintaining a structure, maintaining a system, maintaining a version of life that depends on you staying inside it. And the longer you stay, the more expensive it becomes to leave. Not just financially, but structurally. So the question isn't whether it works. It does. The question is what it costs you to keep it working. Subscribe for more. The system does not reward effort equally. It never has. Because effort is not what the system is designed to prioritize. It rewards position, where you stand inside the structure, what you control, what you influence, what you own. Two people can apply the same effort and receive completely different outcomes. Not because one worked harder, but because one is positioned differently. The worker is rewarded for contribution. They add value. They support the system. But they do not control how that value is distributed. The owner is rewarded for control. They determine where value flows. They benefit from every interaction inside the structure. This is why effort feels inconsistent, because effort alone does not decide outcome. Structure does. If you are inside the system, your effort is filtered, limited, directed, controlled by something above you. You do not capture all of what you produce. If you control the system, you capture the flow. Not just your effort, but the effort of everything moving through it. That is the difference. One participates, The other extracts. And over time, extraction scales. Participation does not. Because participation is tied to capacity. There are limits to what one person can do. Hours run out. Energy runs out. Focus declines. Capacity is fixed. But a system has no such limit. It can expand, add more people, process more volume, generate more output, without requiring equal increases in effort from the owner. So over time, the system begins to favor ownership more and more. Not intentionally, but structurally. Because anything that can scale will outpace anything that cannot. And ownership is scalable. Labor is not. This is why the divide is built in, not created later, not caused by a single decision. It exists from the beginning, in how roles are defined, in how value flows. And once you are inside one side of that structure, everything you do is shaped by it. Your ceiling, your pace, your outcomes. So the system doesn't just reward effort, it amplifies position. And position determines what your effort becomes. Because in the end, two people can work equally hard. But if one controls the structure and the other works inside it, the outcomes will never be the same. Most people never transition out of labor. Not because they can't, but because the system keeps them where they are. It does this quietly, through stability, through routine, through predictability. Things that feel safe. A steady paycheck, a defined role, a clear set of expectations. You know what to do. You know what you'll get. And that structure removes uncertainty. But it also removes leverage, because everything is already defined for you. You don't decide how value is created. You don't decide how it scales. You only operate within the boundaries given. So over time, you become efficient inside the system, better at your role, faster at your tasks, more reliable. But efficiency inside the system does not move you outside of it. It reinforces your position within it. And that's where most people get stuck. Because improvement feels like progress, higher pay, better position, more responsibility. But the structure remains unchanged. You are still exchanging time, still dependent on participation, still resetting when you stop. Ownership requires a different move, not just doing more, but stepping into something uncertain. Because ownership doesn't come with guarantees. No fixed paycheck, no defined outcome, no immediate reward for effort. You build first. You invest time, energy, resources, without knowing when it will return. And that uncertainty is what keeps most people from transitioning. Because the system conditions you to expect immediate exchange. Work, get paid. Ownership breaks that pattern. Work, build, wait. Then, eventually, it returns. But during that gap, there is no reinforcement, no validation, no clear signal that it's working. So most people revert, back to what is certain, back to what pays immediately, back to labor. And every time they do, they reinforce the same position, the same model, the same limitations. This is why the divide persists. Not because access is impossible, but because the transition is uncomfortable. It requires operating without immediate reward, without clear outcomes, without certainty. And most people are not trained for that. They are trained for consistency, for reliability, for predictable exchange. So they stay where the system is clear, where effort equals income, where outcomes are defined. But clarity comes with limits, because defined systems also define ceilings. Ownership removes that ceiling, but replaces it with uncertainty. And that trade-off is what most people avoid. So they continue improving inside a fixed structure, instead of stepping into one that can expand. And over time, that decision compounds. Because staying inside the system keeps outcomes predictable, but limited, while stepping outside introduces risk, but opens scale. And the longer someone delays that shift, the harder it becomes, because they become more dependent on the system they're inside. Pause for a second. If you're still listening, it's probably because this didn't feel exaggerated. That's intentional. If this way of thinking matters to you, like the video, subscribe. We'll keep going deeper. Owners don't just earn differently. They operate with advantages that are built into the structure. Advantages that are not visible at first. The first is control over flow. They decide how value moves, where it goes, who receives it, how it is distributed. A worker participates in the flow. An owner directs it. And direction determines outcome. The second advantage is leverage. Owners are not limited to their own effort. They can use systems, they can use capital, they can use other people's time. So one action can produce multiple results. One decision can influence many outcomes. And that multiplies impact. A worker's output is linear. More effort equals more result. Less effort equals less result. An owner's output is not linear. It can expand without matching increases in effort, because the system carries part of the load. The third advantage is persistence. What they build does not disappear. It continues, it produces, it compounds. A worker must restart. Each day begins again. Each outcome depends on new effort. An owner builds once and benefits repeatedly. Not forever, but long enough for accumulation to take effect. These advantages are not loud. They don't announce themselves. They operate quietly in the background. And because they are not obvious, they are often ignored. People focus on effort, but miss the structure supporting the outcome. So they try to compete at the surface level, working harder, doing more, pushing further. But the underlying position never changes, and without changing position, those advantages remain out of reach, because they are not accessed through effort alone. They are accessed through control. Control of systems, control of assets, control of how value is created and captured. This is why the gap continues to grow, not because one group is constantly pushing harder, but because one group is operating with structural advantages. Advantages that compound, advantages that reinforce themselves, advantages that make future outcomes easier to achieve. Over time, these advantages stack. One builds on another, creating momentum that is difficult to interrupt. And once that momentum exists, it no longer depends on constant effort. It sustains itself. It continues moving forward, while the worker remains dependent on input. Effort must continue. Output must be maintained. So the difference is not just in income, it's in how outcomes are generated. One is produced, the other is extracted. And over long periods of time, that distinction becomes impossible to ignore, because structural advantages do not fade. they expand. At the end of it, the divide is no longer subtle. It's no longer something you have to analyze. It becomes visible in outcomes. One person is still trading time, still tied to effort, still dependent on showing up. Their progress feels controlled, predictable, limited. The other has stepped into ownership, and ownership changes the rules. Because now, their results are not tied directly to what they do today. They've built something that continues, something that produces, something that compounds, even when they are not actively working. And that is where the gap becomes permanent. Not because it can't be closed, but because it's no longer based on effort. It's based on structure, on control, on what continues after you stop. So trying to catch up through effort alone will always feel exhausting, because effort resets. It doesn't carry forward. Ownership carries forward. It builds, it stacks, it expands. And expansion changes everything. Because once something begins to expand, it doesn't just grow, it accelerates. And acceleration creates distance. That's why the gap feels impossible to close. Not because you're behind, but because you're operating in a different model. One model repeats, the other compounds. And over time, compounding always separates. So the real shift is not working harder. It's changing what your effort connects to, what it builds, what it leaves behind. Because in the end, the people ahead are not ahead because they did more. They're ahead because what they built never stopped working. And that is what creates separation. If this changed how you see the system, subscribe. Like this if it clarified something. Most people think they earn money, but what they're actually doing is renting out their time, hour by hour, day by day. And when the time stops, so does the income. This is the foundation of labor. You are paid for presence, for showing up, for performing tasks, for producing output in real time. Nothing carries forward. Owners operate differently. They are not paid for time. They are paid for what time produces. Systems, assets, structures that continue working without constant input. So while one person's income resets every day, the other person's income continues, even when they are not actively working. That is the quiet divide. It doesn't look dramatic. There's no obvious line separating the two. Both are working, both are active, but the nature of their work is different. One is tied directly to effort. The other is tied to ownership. And ownership changes how time behaves. Because once something is owned, it can produce repeatedly. A worker must return to earn again. An owner can continue earning from what already exists. That is where the separation begins. Not in how hard someone works, but in what their work becomes. Does it end when they stop, or does it continue? This is why effort alone doesn't explain outcomes, because effort without ownership resets. It cannot accumulate. Ownership allows accumulation. It allows past effort to remain active, to keep producing, to keep building on itself. And over time, that difference compounds, quietly, consistently, without needing to be visible. So the divide is not loud. It's not announced. It's structural, built into how income is generated, One side exchanges time. The other controls what time produces. And control is what separates them. Workers sell output in segments: an hour, a shift, a week. The structure is simple. Time is exchanged, compensation is received. The cycle repeats. This creates a life that depends on continuity of effort. If work stops, income slows. If work disappears, income disappears with it. There is no distance between labor and payment. They are directly attached. Ownership breaks that attachment, not because owners never work, but because their work is connected to something larger than the moment, something they control, something that remains, something that can continue producing after the original effort is finished. That is the first real shift. A worker is compensated for participation. An owner is compensated for control. Control of the asset, control of the system, control of the structure people move through. And control changes where value flows. When you control the structure, you are no longer limited to what your own hands can do in a day. Other people's labor moves through it. Customers move through it. Transactions move through it. And each of those movements can generate value back to you. This is why the owner-worker divide is not really about status. It is about position inside the system. Are you inside the machine as labor, or are you above the machine as control? Those are two different economic roles. The worker helps the structure function. The owner benefits from the structure functioning. Both may be necessary, but they are not rewarded the same way. A worker's reward is usually capped by time, energy, and availability. There are only so many hours to sell, only so much output one person can create directly. Even high income within labor is still bounded, because the model remains the same. Ownership has a different ceiling, because ownership scales through volume, systems, and repetition. If the asset grows, the return can grow. If more people move through the structure, the return can grow again. The owner does not need to multiply their own hours to multiply outcomes. This is where people often miss the divide. They compare income numbers but ignore the mechanism behind them. A worker making more money than another worker can still be trapped in the same model. Higher pay does not automatically change the structure, because if income still depends on continued labor, the dependency remains, the pressure remains, the reset remains, the vulnerability remains. Only the size of the paycheck changed. Ownership changes the model itself. It introduces persistence. Value can continue moving even when effort is reduced. Returns can continue arriving after the original work is complete. And once persistence exists, compounding becomes possible. That is why owners and workers can exist in the same economy and experience completely different realities. One is focused on maintaining income. The other is focused on expanding what generates income. One protects time. The other accumulates structures. Over time, this becomes more than a financial difference. It becomes a difference in pressure. The worker lives closer to interruption. If something stops, the flow stops. The owner lives closer to continuation. If the structure holds, the flow continues. And that is why the divide stays quiet. Because both sides can look busy. Both sides can look productive. But one is producing to get paid. The other is building what gets paid. That difference is easy to miss when you only look at effort. It becomes obvious when you look at control. Who owns the system? Who benefits from repetition? Who gets paid again without starting from zero? Those questions reveal the real divide. Pause for a second. If you're still listening, it's probably because this didn't feel exaggerated. That's intentional. If this way of thinking matters to you, like the video, subscribe. We'll keep going deeper. At first, the difference between a worker and an owner is not visible. Both wake up, both work, both produce. From the outside, they look the same. But over time, their paths begin to separate. Not because one works harder, but because their roles inside the system are different. The worker stays inside the process. They contribute to output. They keep the system running. But they do not control what happens beyond their role. The owner steps outside the process. They design it. They control it. They benefit from everything that flows through it. And that control creates leverage. Because once you control the structure, you don't need to participate in every part of it. The system runs. People move through it. Value is created. And a portion of that value returns to you. This is where scaling begins. A worker scales by increasing effort, more hours, more output, more energy. But effort has limits. An owner scales by expanding the system. More people, more transactions, more volume moving through the same structure. And that scale is not tied to personal time. So over time, the difference grows. Not suddenly, not in a way that draws attention, but consistently. Because one person is limited by capacity and the other is expanded by structure. Capacity stays fixed. Structure can grow. This is why effort alone cannot close the gap, because effort does not change position. It only increases output within the same role. To change outcomes, the role itself has to change, from participant to controller, from labor to ownership. And that shift is not just financial, it's structural. It changes how value flows to you. Because once you move into ownership, you are no longer paid only for what you do. You are paid for what the system does. And the system can do more than any single person. That is where the real separation forms, not in effort, not in intelligence, but in position relative to control. And once that position is established, it begins to reinforce itself. More control leads to more opportunity. More opportunity leads to more expansion. And expansion leads to more control again. A loop forms, one that grows quietly, consistently, without needing to be seen. Meanwhile, the worker remains inside the loop of effort. Work, earn, reset. Work, earn, reset. And over time, those two loops move further apart, not by force, but by design. Because the system does not reward activity equally. It rewards control differently than participation. And that difference compounds. At a certain point, the difference stops feeling small. It stops looking like a slight advantage and starts looking like two completely different paths. One person is still tied to effort. Every result depends on what they do today. Every outcome resets tomorrow. The other is no longer operating like that. Their past actions are still active, still producing, still compounding. And that changes everything. Because once effort begins to persist, time starts working differently for you. It no longer measures what you do, it multiplies what you've built. This is where the divide becomes permanent, not because it can't be closed, but because most people never change position. They try to catch up using the same model. More effort, more hours, more pressure. But the structure stays the same. And structure is what determines outcome, not intensity, not intention. So the gap continues to expand. quietly, consistently, without needing to be seen. Because one person is building something that continues, while the other is repeating something that ends. And over time, continuation always outpaces repetition. This is why the divide exists, not as a moment, but as a system. And once you see it clearly, you stop focusing on doing more and start focusing on what continues, what remains, what compounds. Because in the end, the people ahead are not ahead because they worked more. They're ahead because what they built never stopped working. And that is what time protects. If this changed how you see the system, subscribe. Like this if it shifted your perspective. You wake up, you move, you work. You try to stay consistent, and yet it feels like you're always behind. Not in a dramatic way, not in a failure sense, but in a quiet, persistent pressure that never really leaves. There's always something catching up to you. Bills that arrive faster than expected, expenses that feel slightly higher than last month, goals that seem to move just a little further away the moment you get closer. You adjust, you cut back, you try to optimize, but the gap doesn't close. It stretches. Because what you're experiencing isn't a lack of effort. It's a mismatch between how fast you move and how fast the system moves around you. You think progress is linear. Work more, earn more, save more, and over time things should stabilize. But that assumption only works in a stable environment, and this isn't one. Prices don't wait, markets don't pause, systems don't slow down so you can catch your breath. They move continuously, quietly, relentlessly, and most of the time, faster than you realize. So while you're measuring your progress in steps, the system is moving in momentum. That's why it feels like you're always catching up. Because you are, but not to where you started, to where things have already moved. And by the time you reach that point, it's already shifted again. So the effort isn't the issue. The direction isn't even the issue. The speed mismatch is. And until you see that clearly, it will keep feeling like you're doing everything right and still falling slightly behind. And the more you try to compensate with effort, the more subtle the pressure becomes. You wake up earlier. You try to be more efficient. You cut unnecessary spending. You do what you're supposed to do. But the system isn't responding to your effort. It's responding to its own structure. Inflation doesn't adjust based on how disciplined you are. Markets don't slow down because you're trying harder. Costs don't stabilize because you've decided to be more responsible. They move independently. And they move collectively. Housing, food, energy, access, everything shifts together. So even when you gain ground in one area, you lose it somewhere else. And over time, that creates a constant feeling of recalibration. You're always adjusting, always catching up, always slightly behind where you thought you'd be. And what makes it more difficult is that the movement is subtle. It's not one big jump. It's small, continuous shifts. Prices inch upward, standards increase, expectations quietly rise. And because it's gradual, you don't notice it immediately. You just feel the pressure. And eventually, that pressure starts to feel normal. You stop questioning it. You start adapting to it. You assume this is just how life works. Always moving, always adjusting, never fully arriving. Not because you're incapable, but because the system you're inside of was never designed to move at your pace. The baseline is not fixed. You think you're working toward a level, a point where things finally stabilize, where income holds, where pressure eases, where it starts to feel like enough. But that level doesn't stay where you left it. It moves. Not suddenly, not violently, but constantly. Rent shifts upward. Food prices adjust. Services increase. Access becomes more expensive over time. And none of it asks for your timing. None of it waits for your situation. So while you're climbing toward stability, stability itself is moving higher. That's the part that creates the tension, because you're not chasing something fixed, you're chasing something that drifts. You increase your income, but the environment expands with it. You improve your position, but the system recalibrates around you. And it doesn't feel aggressive, it feels subtle. A small increase here, a quiet adjustment there. Nothing that forces panic, but enough to prevent stability. And over time, that subtle movement compounds. Because consistency is what compounds, not intensity, not effort. Consistency. So the baseline keeps rising, whether you notice it or not, and your progress has to keep matching it. That's why it never feels like you've arrived, because the definition of enough doesn't stay still long enough to reach. You get closer, and it moves. You adjust, and it adjusts with you. So the gap doesn't come from failure. It comes from movement. Constant movement. And most people respond the same way. They try to increase effort, work longer, push harder, take on more, move faster. But speed doesn't solve a moving baseline. It only keeps you in alignment with it for a moment. Then it shifts again. And that creates something subtle. Not stress, not panic. Instability. A constant need to adjust. A constant sense of recalibration. You're always correcting, always responding, always trying to stay even, but never fully settled. Because the system you're inside of doesn't hold still long enough for you to feel like you've reached it. It keeps moving, and you keep adjusting with it. If this feels familiar, if you've felt this pressure but never had words for it, this channel isn't here to motivate you. It's here to help you see clearly. If that resonates, like the video. Subscribe. More clarity is coming. You assume income grows with time, but if you stay consistent, it will eventually catch up. That effort translates forward in a straight line, but income doesn't move the way the system moves. It reacts, it lags, it adjusts slowly, while everything around it adjusts instantly. Prices update in real time. Markets reprice continuously. Access shifts without warning. Entire sectors move before you even notice the change. But your income waits. It waits for raises, it waits for approvals, it waits for cycles that move far slower than the environment itself. So even when you improve your position, you're improving inside a system that has already moved ahead of you. That's the gap. Not effort, not intelligence, timing, speed, structure. The system moves at capital speed. You move at labor speed. And those two speeds are not the same. Capital compounds continuously. It builds on itself whether you are present or not. Labor compounds conditionally. Only when you're active, only when you're working, only when you're present. So while you're progressing step by step, capital is scaling without interruption. And that difference doesn't feel obvious at first. It feels small, manageable, almost invisible, because early on, the distance is narrow. But time changes that, because time favors what compounds automatically and works against what requires constant input. So as time passes, the system accelerates in places you're not participating in. Assets grow, costs adjust, standards increase, access tightens, and your income tries to follow behind all of it. But it never quite aligns, because it's always responding after the shift has already happened. Then the gap shows up in cost, in access, in positioning, in options, in the difference between what you can reach and what keeps moving out of range. And it keeps widening, not because you slowed down, but because the system never did. So you respond the only way that feels logical. You increase output, more hours, more effort, more intensity, more attempts to accelerate yourself. But output doesn't fix a structural speed mismatch. It only stretches your capacity further, until eventually you hit a limit. Because labor has limits. Time has limits. Energy has limits. Attention has limits. But the system you're inside of doesn't operate within those same constraints. It scales beyond them, continuously, quietly, without needing your participation. That's why it feels like you're always catching up, because you are, but not to where you started, to where the system has already moved. And by the time you get there, it has already moved again. So the gap isn't something you close once. It's something that keeps reopening, because the speed difference never disappears. It compounds. And the longer you stay inside that structure without changing position, the more visible it becomes. Not as failure, but as distance. A distance created by two different systems moving at two different speeds. One tied to your time, the other detached from it. And over time, that difference defines everything. At some point, it starts to click. Not emotionally, structurally. You realize the feeling isn't random. It's not inconsistency. It's not lack of discipline. It's position. You've been trying to keep up inside a system that doesn't stabilize, a system that moves faster than effort can match, a system that rewards what scales and slowly compresses what doesn't. So the question shifts. Not, how do I work harder, but what am I positioned inside of? Because effort inside the wrong structure doesn't compound. It resets. Every month, every cycle, every adjustment, you rebuild the same ground while the system continues moving forward. That's why it feels endless. Because it is, if nothing changes structurally. You can optimize your time. You can reduce expenses. You can increase effort. But none of that changes the direction of the system itself. And direction is what determines outcome. Not just speed, not just consistency. Direction. So the goal was never to catch up, because catching up assumes the system will wait. It won't. The goal is to stop operating at a speed that requires constant reaction, to stop depending on structures that reset every cycle, and start moving toward positions that hold. Positions where income doesn't fully depend on time, growth doesn't require constant input, Progress doesn't reset when you stop, where movement continues even when you don't. Because that's the difference. Not effort, structure. Most people never see that shift. They stay inside the same loop, working, adjusting, catching up, repeating. Not because they're incapable, but because the system never taught them to look at it differently. So the pressure doesn't disappear, but it becomes clear. You're not behind. You're inside a system that keeps moving forward, whether you're ready or not. And once you see that, you stop trying to chase it blindly. You start paying attention to where you stand inside it, because that's what determines whether you keep catching up or whether something finally starts moving with you. Subscribe. Like this if it shifted your perspective.